Namaste and greetings. I, Shweta Shankar, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Learning. Today, we are gathered here for day 4 of Law and Public Policy Youth Fellowship, an online national summer school program, a 2-month online immersive legal awareness and action research certificate training course, and internship program. This program is organized by the IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. The chair for the program is Professor Vibhuti Patel, visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI, and the fellow lead advisor and expert legal hands-on sessions is Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam, visiting senior fellow, IMPRI. The distinguished experts include Shri Sandeep Chachra, Professor Vibhuti Patel, Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam, Advocate Dr. Vahida Nayanar, Professor Mukul Asher, Professor Uday Shankar, Shri Udit Mishra, Dr. Nivedita P. Haran, Shri Bhartendra Singh Baswan, Dr. Purnima Chauhan, Advocate Dr. Albertina Almeida, Dr. Gladstone Xavier, Professor Aruna Roy, Advocate Audrey D. Mello, Dr. Kaustubh K. Bandyopadhyay, Advocate Mrinalini Deshmukh, Advocate Flavia Agnes, Dr. Rashmi Singh, Mr. Debaditya Sinha, Professor Swaran Singh, Advocate Lara Jasani, Professor Anil K. Gupta, Justice Ajit K. Singh, Mr. Himanshu Shekhar, Dr. Amar Jasani, Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, Mr. Bilal Khan, Shri Rajiv Ranjan Singh, Shri Tikendra Singh Panwar, Shri Shailesh Gandhi, Dr. Simi Mehta, Advocate Abdul Hafiz Gandhi, Professor Amita Singh, Dr. Ajay Gudavarti, Shri Amit Dubey, Professor Sangamitra Acharya, Dr. Y. Suresh Reddy, Advocate Sanchita Ayan, Shri Surendranath Tripathi. The conveners for this course are Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and editorial at IMPRI, editorial director at IMPRI, Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam, visiting senior fellow IMPRI, and Dr. Arjun Kumar, director at IMPRI. I welcome you all to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for putting your time, energy, and efforts into truly understanding the vital role and complex intricacies of legal and public policy frameworks. The course will enable the participants to comprehend the nuances and technicalities of legal and public policy paradigms and therefore acquire theoretical insights along with technical skills to conduct research. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources document in your email for your kind perusal. We will be providing videos of each session for flexible learning at your place and pace. Before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules. First, it is imperative that you join the meeting on time. Second, there will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Third, share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Fourth, the questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise. Fifth, refrain from making general comments in the questions to save time. Our session for Day 3 will cover topics of policy initiatives and the role of Indian judiciary by Professor Uday Shankar and laws and public policy and media by Shri Udit Mishra. To start the session, we invite Professor Vibhuti Patel for our opening chair remarks. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Shweta, and welcome Professor Uday Shankar and the esteemed participants. First of all, I thank Dr. Arjun Kumar, IMPRI team, for this putting this course together. And we are now entering the second week of our course. And I would just have a brief outline of what happened, transpired so far. Mr. Sandeep Chachra, he provided the overall macro ideological framework and its interlinkages with the laws and public policy, while Professor Vibhuti Patel, myself, I did the sectoral analysis and how in different sectors of India's economy and society, laws and public policies play an important role. Dr. Shalu Nigam began with describing multiple legal perspectives and also her personal experiences as an active lawyer. Dr. Vahida Nayanar, she gave a threadbare and very detailed analysis of international human rights laws, its applications, impact, and relevance. And then we had Professor Mukul Asher, who also provided a very important theoretical underpinnings about the India's macroeconomic challenges. He also said that we need to balance rights and responsibilities and duties, and also select biases which are enshrined in the Constitution of India in terms of affirmative action. About that also, he created so many thought-provoking questioning, and which resulted in many questions, very, very detailed question answer session, even from the participants. Now, today, what we have is two important subjects which will be analyzed and deliberated upon by Professor Uday Shankar on policy initiatives and role of Indian judiciary, and followed by Dr. Shalu Udit Mishra's presentation on laws, public policy, and media. Thank you very much, and over to IMPRI.
Thank you, ma'am. Professor Uday Shankar is the Registrar and Professor of Law at Hidyatullah National Law University, Raipur. I would request Professor Uday Shankar ji to start his session on the topic of policy initiatives and the role of Indian judiciary. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. And as the topic suggested by me is on reviewing of the policy by judiciary, I'll try to speak on what is the whole issues with regard to reviewing of the policy by the judiciary, and how the court has been treating the power. So before we get into that question, let me first give a kind of an idea about the distinction what we draw as a law student between policy and law. So policy, generally how we look at it is we look at it from the perspective of action plan which the government formulates in order to minimize the discretion of the administrative machineries. And that action plan also is based on certain statistics, certain data, certain empirical basis, and therefore that is certainly be tempted to kind of change one. So that's the reason why we, as a law student, make a distinction between law and policy. That where we find law is more tenable and more concrete in comparison to policy, because policy is susceptible to change, and such changes are to be welcomed also, because situation scenarios may change, the background against which the policy has been framed may get changed, and therefore that necessitates the change in the policy formulation. Now, with this background, we need to understand that how the policies need to be addressed through a judicial process. So there are two schools of thought, I would put it. One school of thought says that there shouldn't be any review of policy because it is entirely into the domain of the executive, and therefore there shouldn't be any intervention of the judiciary on policy domain, primarily on this count that the issues of the formulation of policies is more of the expertise domain, the ground reality, and which possibly the court may not be aware of, or court may not have the competence to evaluate it accordingly. And the second school of thought is that every organ of the state needs to discharge the responsibility within a defined boundary, and therefore it is desirable that boundary has been maintained, and it is the judiciary which has been assigned to maintain that boundary. So I'll present the views from both the sides, and because it is a kind of fellowship program where I believe it would be advisable to leave the question open-ended so that you go back and deliberate. The participants of this program deliberate on the topic and arrive at the conclusion based on the kind of learnings they are taking from this capacity building program, this fellowship program. So for first school of thought on why the review should not be done on policy matter, it has largely got a connect with the very idea of separation of power, where it has been suggested that one branch of the state should not interfere with the other branch of the state. And in that regard, it is also been suggested that that such intervention would disturb the constitutional uh, scheme and would unnecessarily create a culture of I would put it competition, which would be leading to unhealthy tradition. And possibly because of this reason, this has been advised that let policy be exclusive domain of the executive and let the judiciary not interfere unless and until that policy translates into law and gets a kind of a stamping and approval of the legislature. So there are policies which gets converted into law, and then after that such review is permitted. Though this is not a very standard practice, I must tell. There are instances where even after law, policies are being formulated. For example, we have Right to Education Act, and we have a national education policy also. We do have a series of legislations dealing with intellectual property, and we do have IP policy. So it is not that there is a kind of clear demarcation when you talk about law and policy. And it is also not very correct to say that policy always graduates into law. As I said, there are instances where we do have laws and then we do have, policies also. Same is the case with Electricity Act. In fact, Electricity Act itself, one of the provisions of the Act itself talks about the formulation of the policy. So the very, I would say, traditional understanding that it is a policy which precedes law is not very. So something which we need to learn, which we need to understand very categorically. And on this premise, it has been suggested that let the judiciary be stayed away from the review of the policy, because the background, the considerations which has been taken into account for formulating a policy may be very situation specific, may be based on certain factors which demands a particular way of action, and judiciary must not get into those actions. So this is one school of thought I put it. The other school of thought would be is that when we have a separation of power, it is also true that all the institutions of the state must perform their responsibilities, must discharge their duties within the boundaries which have been assigned to them. So what if they're not assigned, they're not doing that duty? What if there is something which has not been happening? So in that case, it is suggested, it is kind of responsibility entrusted to one of the institutions to flag such breach or to rectify such breach, and which institution is to be given the responsibility to undertake that task. So obviously such institution should be an independent institution, and which is the judiciary. So considering this argument, it has been stated that the judiciary does have a role to give a kind of policy check. The judiciary does have a role to evaluate and assess that whether the policy formulation is as per the constitutional scheme or not, whether the discretion vested through that policy document is unreasonable. So the fine line which has been drawn where judiciary can interfere is between the illegality and irregularity. It has been suggested that if it is a case of illegality, judiciary can very well interfere. if it is a case of irregularity, judiciary need not interfere. I'll try to explain this by giving this example or elaboration, you may say, that, for example, government takes a call of reducing the cost subsidy. Now, if cost subsidy in electricity sector, and while formulating a policy for reducing cost subsidy in electricity sector, government discriminates from one entity to another entity, then such discrimination would go against the scheme of the constitution, and therefore it would be appropriate on the part of the judiciary to make intervention. And other situation where there may be some kind of technical error on the part of the government on arriving at the formula of cost subsidy, where instead of result A, the government has adopted result B. In such situation, judiciary must not interfere. Judiciary must not step into the wisdom of the executive. Judiciary must refrain from imposing its own wisdom, imposing its own conditions on the executive. So irregularity and illegality is, you may say, a kind of test to validate the judicial intervention. Now, in India, we had seen that there is a kind of mixed responses from the judiciary on the issue of review of policy. When I say mixed, what I mean is that there are instances where the court has categorically refused to interfere on the very ground that it pertains to policy decision and therefore we shouldn't be getting into it. On the other hand, the court has come very heavy on certain policies which otherwise apparently appears to be the case exclusively belonging to the executive. For example, I'll give two examples to substantiate this. One is, I'll give the example of Balco Employees Union case, which is an interesting case to look at, where employees union of the organization called Balco, which was a public sector undertaking at that point of time. The employees union approached the court challenging the very decision of privatization of the public sector undertaking. And court, while examining the issue, court said that privatization is a policy question. And it is the government which knows better that what kind of policy is to be adopted for industrial sector. And on that count, the court has refused to do so, refused to interfere, and court said that considering the policy decision, we would like to not to get into this. There is one instance where court has refused to look into the questions. In fact, if you go deeper into analysis, you would find that even we do have a provision in the Constitution, 43 capital A. It talks about participation of workers in the management of company or management of industrial sector. So, going by a kind of analysis, one could argue that if the whole decision of privatization was not taken in consultation with the workers, then was it not a very appropriate case for the judicial intervention? But there is one set of argument. So in this case, the court has refused to interfere. On the other hand, all of us are aware, and it has created a lot of noise. Also, the case on 2G spectrum, which is a case of a spectrum allocation, where the court has made intervention, and court has said that the very policy on allocation of the spectrum was violative of Article 14. And court has given an interesting observation. Court has said that any policy which causes loss to the public exchequer, and which and in this case, the court has said that because the spectrum belongs to public, and through that allocation policy, certain players were being preferred, and therefore it amounts to violation of equality clause, where the court has given a kind of a wide understanding to the power to be vested on the government to formulate policies, and what are the checks and balances. So when you look at these two approaches, you find that the approach is not very consistent in India. Judiciary has been, taking the positions depending upon the what kind of subject matter is coming before the court. But at the same time, the court has also been, I would say we must appreciate and applaud the position of the court. The court has been interfering on the policy domain wherever there is a question of violation of rule of law, wherever there is a violation of equality, wherever there is a position of unreasonableness and arbitrariness, court has been interfering, and court has been, doing the course corrections. So in that regard, we must say that the activism which the court is displaying on the matter of policy evaluation is to be appreciated, and also is to be seen more of a kind of institutional mechanism of balancing the institution, balancing the kind of functioning amongst the institutions. Because when you look into the issue of separation of power in India, you find that in India we do not have separation of power in very traditional sense, the way it operates in the United States. But we do have separation of function, where there is a clear demarcation of responsibility between the executive, between the legislature, and between the judiciary. So there is a clear-cut demarcation between the functionings of the institutions in India. In fact, we do have only one provisions under the Indian Constitution that talks about separation of power. That is Article 50 of the Constitution, which says that judiciary must be separate from the executive. So on that light, when you look at, you find that the kind of guidelines has already been laid down. I'll bring in another argument which also in a way suggests that why judiciary needs to refrain. Judiciary needs to refrain because of the reason that when you look at the constitutional scheme of fundamental rights and directive principles in the country, what we find is that directive principles has a different scheme altogether, where it has been categorically suggested that it is the responsibility of the executive and the legislature to enact laws or formulate policies to give effect to directive principles. In a way, there is a clear direction that judiciary needs to stay away when it comes to such kind of action plan from the side of the government, which has a connect with directive principles given in the under the Constitution. So I would conclude by saying this, that judicial intervention per se is not unconstitutional. It is not that there is a kind of clear mandate given or direction given that such interventions are not to be entertained and welcomed. But at the same time, it is also to be kept in mind that policy domain is the domain of the executive, and it requires a certain element of flexibility. The policy formulation requires certain element of flexibility, and which must be regarded and respected by the judiciary. So that way, unless and until there is a clear breach of constitutional values, there is a clear breach of constitutional scheme, it is highly desirable that the judiciary refrains itself from interfering in the matter of policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening our gathering. Now I request the chair, Professor Vibhuti ma'am, to share her remarks.
very important concern. Oh my God, I have unmuted. Okay. So very important concern about the relationship of judiciary and executive. And I think it is a very, very old debate. And we also had in a previous session also that what should be the code of conduct for both judiciary as well as the executive. And I think so, example of Balco, yes, where judiciary refused to take stand, but there have been many, many examples where Justice Krishna Iyer, Justice Bhagwati, during the 80s took very important decisions, and that also resulted in the new policy. For example, forest policy, when the forest dwellers, they highlighted the cases and documentation and research was done on the nefarious activities of the timber merchant and the timber mafia and so many other vested interests who were creating existential crisis for the tribal communities. I think Mr. Sandeep Chachra also gave a case study of what was happening, which resulted into public interest litigation and a new law, forest, the amendments that we had about forest law, or even the question of manual scavenging. It was the pressure from the Dalit organizations because of whom we got this ban on manual scavenging. And after that also, all the local self-government have been guilty of flouting the rule, and still manual scavenging is happening, documentary evidences are given, and underground cleaning is happening even in cities like Bombay. And National Human Rights Commission and so many progressive judgments have also come in this direction. Similarly, on n number of women's issues, whether it is about the gender-based violence or acid attacks or trafficking of girls and women, and the question of organ trafficking for either sex slavery or organ trafficking, organ transplant, or even in cases of surrogacy and all. Things some very important, and especially in the crimes in the name of honor, where the choice-based marriages take place and their own family members are killing them, their children. In those cases, even Justice Kajju, though we don't have a law, but still the judgments, progressive judgments that we have got because from the judiciary, like Justice Kajju, he said that these are the crimes against humanity, and we need to have a structures and mechanisms to provide support. And as a result of which, we know that so many state governments have created support system and the shelter and the safe places for. So the executive had to be active because of this progressive judgment. So I think it's a very, very important the dynamics that we experience so far as, and it is not only in India, but I think in so many South Asian countries, whether it's in Nepal or Pakistan, or even in the Middle Eastern countries, this whole tug of war between executive and judiciary is a very, very important concern, and it has been this debate we need to be aware of. And I thank Professor Uday Shankar for enlightening us on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Now the floor is open for the questions from the audience.
Yeah. Dikshita has a question. Dikshita ji, you can speak.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, sir, ask one question. I have a doubt actually. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
So as per Article 32 and 226 of the Indian Constitution, judiciary can consider any law or the action of executive as an unconstitutional or void. So this is the matter of judicial activism.
Yeah.
But what are the factors that leads to judicial overreach? Means what are the things that convert the judicial activism into judicial overreach? So how you can say that now it's a judicial overreach?
I will say the formula to assess a case between judicial activism and overreach we need to simply look at what task belongs to whom. And judiciary's task slightly differs from the other two organizations in ensuring check and balance. So if judiciary's task is moving beyond check and balance, and it is amounting to stepping into the shoes of other two institutions, then it would be a case of overreach. As long as it is drawing that balance, as long as it is checking the exercise of the power, it would be a case of activism. So that's how I simply look at it between activism and overreach.
Sir, but I do follow-up question. I want to know cancelling of National Judicial Appointments Commission Bill 2014 by the Supreme Court. Is it overreach or a judicial activism? In what category?
It is neither a case of activism or overreach. It is simply a case of examining the law and the constitutional amendment against the touchstone of the Constitution. And how it is to look at that whether the proposed scheme was in alignment with the very principles of independence of judiciary or not. Court found that it was not. One of the reasons on which the court has given this observation was based on the composition of the newly found body, which was supposed to play a role in recommending the name for the appointment. So, to me, that is not a case of activism or overreach. It's all about applying the law and legal position on NJSC as it was proposed and formulated in the form of law and the constitutional amendment. Because it is not a very easy debate and not a very simple debate, I would say, when you look into the appointment of judges. And though we draw the parallels from other jurisdictions, but every jurisdiction has its own demand and has its own space. I mean, that is, I believe, a bigger topic altogether and a separate topic altogether to debate and to deliberate.
Thank you, sir. If any other participant have any question, please raise your hand or type in Q&A or chat box.
I have a question about the role of NHRC, National Human Rights Commission, Executive and Judiciary. What is your understanding of so many times in NHRC, especially during the pandemic, the intervention of NHRC about free distribution of food, starting of community kitchen, or the gross violation of democratic rights which the police had done. So this also brings into focus the relationship of judiciary and the behavior of criminal justice system as such, including the police. What would you like to say?
See, my understanding on the very realization of rights stands on this footing that rights needs to be more informed, more to be realized on the lines of respect than enforcement. Our problem is that, or you may say that the way we have been, getting either educated, you may say, or trained, you may say, that we are more into giving emphasis to enforcement aspect of it, and therefore we always look up at the institutions which have got that power of sort. I would say the relationship between NHRC, executive, and the legislature, all these must be based on the idea of respect. You have an institution, NHRC. It has been given a mandate, and if it is doing the needful as per the mandate, it must be respected. And we also, as a end user, I would say, needs to build that understanding. So that is something which I believe a kind of transformational need is required. That's why I mean, if you, I would say that, let's say during pandemic, interestingly, we had seen police agencies really taking control of situation. They were not trained to address the pandemic like situation. But then we do have that kind of kind of setup where we believe that they are the one who are supposed to always look into it.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a question too. What are the challenges or limitations that judiciary face in making or say influencing public policy in India? Because one of the major challenges that I would mention is backlog of cases in courts. So, how does these challenges influence the making of public policy or by the judiciary? How does it work?
See, the backlog of cases also reflects one more thing which we often not acknowledge or refuse to acknowledge, is the faith in the system. That is also one way of looking at it. Yeah, we do have challenges in addressing the backlogs. I believe with technological intervention it can be done, and it is being done. The other way is that to look for alternate dispute resolution through mediation conciliation, that is being done. Now, on the policy and law balancing, what is needed to be done is that we must exercise discretion very carefully so that the matter should not end up in the court of law. There where we need to be very careful. And that's what is the responsibility of the people sitting in the position. That they must exercise the power as it is been given in the policy, and to be very careful that the decision must not unnecessarily land up in the court of law. And that's why an important aspect of that is policy formulation and an advice related to policy formulation for decision making process.
Okay, sir, I also have a question. Yes. So, sir, we have seen that as judiciary interact and for most of the public policy programs or schemes, there is a lot of reporting by CAG audits. So we also have state audits, state level government audit, social audit, gender budget audit, a lot of different kind of audits going on. And time and again in India, we face this problem of implementation. Fair, balanced distribution, also we can say in different public policy schemes, how we interfere. So how do you see this development of audits? Because despite several audits, things don't improve. So how do you see this as, work in progress vis-a-vis judiciary? Judiciary takes steps, but again, it's become redundant. So how do you see this development?
See, this is more, we need to understand that, in a kind of constitutional democracy, how the things operates. Many times the result may not be visible on a given, on a very timeline specific, the way we look at it. But then we do see reflections, we do see, kind of responses based on those audits. Now, I would put it in this way, that the intervention by the judiciary creates a sort of, narrative, creates a sort of, kind of a debate and deliberation, which plays an important role in giving effect to those audits, I would say. That is one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, that judiciary works on faith. So as long as that faith is there, I believe it would be easier for judiciary to address the issues. Dr. Arjun, I need to take a leave now. I have some assignment. So other questions can be posted to me. I'll respond.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Despite your busy schedule, you joined. Have a nice day. Thank you.
For the invite, and it's a pleasure talking to the participants and knowing Madam Patel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So Udit sir has not joined. I'll just check. Meanwhile, if any participant have any question, thoughts, they can share with us.
Dr. Shalu, Nigam, would you like to give your opinion
Yes.
on the debate? Yeah,
I'll just-
because you are also dealing with both judiciary as well as executive as a practicing lawyer.
No, the one thing about the backlog of case which came up during the discussion is really wondering, as a lawyer, if I go to the court and I see that the maximum cases are being filed by the state, where the state is a major litigant, major party in most of the cases. And I've seen even in the High Court and the Supreme Court where the judges are scolding the executive in front of us that, okay, why for such a small decision, the litigants have to come to the court. So these kind of things are really happening, that the executive and, the other two organs are not, actively, taking decisions, and that is creating a lot of problems for the common citizens. And at most of the time, the laws are being interpreted, in such an arbitrary manner that people have to come to the court. So that is another major area, kind of training, the sensitization of, all the three organs of the state. So those are the things I think we need to consider when we talk about law and policy, that, the kind of, the pro-people policies, the pro-citizens initiative, so that citizens don't have to come to the court for very small things that, okay, this thing is not happening, this decision is taken wrong, or, so many other things. So that is what I think we need to look into. This is what, as a lawyer and as a, litigant, I really, have this kind of thing. But,
So which are the examples of state taking initiative, state as a litigant? Can you give a couple of examples of state as, because that would be useful for our participants.
Like, say, for example, in the passport case, like I'll give you example of my own case. Now my daughter's passport has to be renewed. Now the passport office, they said that no, father's name is essential. I said no, father's name is not essential, since her passport is made without the father's name for since she was a child. And then they insisted, but then finally I have to go to the court. To the Delhi High Court, and then in the court several dates took place, and then finally the court says that no, there is no such rules in the passport policy, and now the policy has changed. Now a single parent can file for the passport application. So these very small thing, but then I have to run around from from passport office to the court, and so many, like, so much time and energy has gone into that. So such a small decision, but these kind of things are happening. And there are various other examples also, like ABC versus State, Union of India. That woman, she went to the Supreme Court, and then the court has to say that even a unwed mother has a has right, the passport of the child could be made in the name of just unwed mother, because mother don't want to reveal the name of the father. So that shouldn't be a problem. Similarly, there are a lot of cases about registration of birth. For simple things like spelling mistakes or other things, cases are coming to the courts. So in registration, the executive has a power. They could amend it depending, seeing the papers and documents. But the litigants are coming to the court. So, these kind of small minor things, but people are made to run around. So these are the kind of things.
That Gita Hariharan case, where a minor child, bank account, that can mother's signature. They all asked for the guardian's signature, and mother signed and bank did not accept. So even the guardianship rule of Ward and Guardianship Act, that also there was a change, and the PIL was filed by.
So even the Vandana Shiva's case was similar. They need, the father was out, and then they need the name of the father on the bank account. So, those kind of small, simple things which could have been handled at the level of, the local office, but then people have to run around. And therefore, the state becomes a major, party on the other side. You have to say the municipal authority, the passport office, or whichever authority that is there. So you have to file a case against that. So that becomes a major, time consuming. The court's time goes into all these things. So
Yeah.
that is why the judges they generally scold many of the executive in front of us that, this decision could have been taken at your level. Why you have not taken this decision? So these kind of things are happening every day in the courts.
Yeah. The spending case is a major challenge for the Indian judiciary, and the Indian criminal justice system, because so many times even the police is not able to send the forensic report, FIRs, and other documentation, Panchanama, to the court on time. That also delays. No, so it is all three have to work in tandem, like the police and administration as well as the judiciary.
Yeah, the criminal justice system, again, the people are like, there are so many, if you study the prisons, how many people are in the prison and, what is the background, you will find that a lot of poor people are in the prison, again, because they are not able to find lawyers, and because of which, rich people can easily escape, because for them it is easy to find lawyers and, to pay for the money. They can afford all kind of luxuries. But for poor, it is difficult, and therefore you will find that in prisons, a lot of poor people are there, and sometimes even the way the police work, that at the end, basically it is they can't prove the charges against the person. So it's a lot of human rights violation cases are taking place that way.
Yeah.
So
And
these
I
are
think those who are most gullible, they suffered the most. There was a very thin, lanky, extremely petite woman, young girl. She was a pickpocket, petty criminal. But there were allegations of 14 murders. Can you imagine? On that girl? And finally, the human rights organization, they proved that it was nothing, because police could not find the real criminal in so many cases of murder, that everything was just put on her, this thing, and she was languishing in prison. She did not even know. She was just a petty criminal. She could have been, and the lawyer argued that she should be punished for the pickpocketing, which is maybe 6 months prison or whatever. But she can't be like treated as a hardened criminal who murdered 14 people. So this also happened, but she did not have any lawyer. So when the human rights organization, they sent their interns, they found out this case of a girl by talking to her in a prison. So many times it is the social work institutions and the human rights groups and community-based organization who have access to, who are allowed to interact with the prisoners, either as teacher or as to read the collective reading. And then so many such heartbreaking stories come out. Yeah.
Sir has joined. We can start the session.
Yes.
Shweta, please go ahead.
Shankar Udit Mishra is the Deputy Associate Editor at the Indian Express. Now I would request Shri Udit Mishra ji to start his session on the topic of laws, public policy and media. So welcome and over to you.
So you can unmute. Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yes.
you. Thank you for the invitation. And let me just because there's no specific question that I need to answer. I just wanted to possibly introduce the students to what are the sort of, the most essential link between Sorry, I think it got disturbed in between. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I'm presuming that most of the students here are in their early 20s, if I'm correct. Is that correct?
They're youth. Below 30.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. So, the reason why I asked for that age is because, the media landscape itself has changed quite dramatically over the last 2 decades. When I look back every 5 years, something dramatic has happened, and I expect fairly dramatic changes in media in the coming 5-year, phases, especially with the now introduction of artificial intelligence. This has a bearing on media's role and the interplay with public policy. So in essence, to the students, I would like to say that the first thing is to understand what is, if you had to summarize media's role, the job, what it is. It is reporting facts. Those two words, reporting facts. It's not the search of truth. It is not opinion. None of that. It is just reporting facts. As I recently saw has been popularized in some TV serial, online serial, where it says that if one person says it's raining outside and the other says it's not raining, then the media's job is to open the window and check what is the fact. And that's the heart of all that media must do. It might do other things also, but it must do this essential bit. Why does this matter? Because, say, at least 20 years ago, when there was only or largely print media, TV was just coming up, there were only two credible institutions from whom you could get facts. One was the government, the other was the media. You would presume that the media would go out and collect facts and report it to you through the regular processes. And then what we've seen, that we've had television revolution, news revolution, and I was part of that. I was part of TV newsrooms, and I was also part of, later on, with the magazine, Forbes India magazine, which launched in 2009. What we saw is that the television news really sped past, and that whole notion of 24-hour news put a lot of pressure on reporting facts, because just reporting facts takes a lot of time. So increasingly, TV channels had to push themselves to sort of go to opinion, just to sort of fill up time, or rerun a lot of news, and so overemphasize certain things and not emphasize others. And we also saw over time that print publications took a hit. Things like magazines just went out of the window. Earlier, most homes 20 years ago, I would imagine 30 years ago, most homes would have a few magazines. Either they'll buy them or have them, and those magazines allowed people to have more reflective pieces. Facts could be reported in a more diligent manner. Over time, that has gone out of the window. Most magazines are struggling or are ineffectual. Now we are also finding that even TV news has taken a hit, not just the newspapers or print publications, because of the advent of social media. So now facts are no longer, as is said by one of the social media influencers, facts are not facts. Anything can be presented on social media, and for a short period of time, it might appear like a fact until unless it is fact checked. So now the whole process that used to happen within the newsroom is now sort of happening in public, and it makes it very difficult for us to believe collectively as a society what are facts, what are the facts on which we'll base our decision making. Now, that is one part of what's happening to media and the trouble that it's having with competing with social media, which may throw up relevant facts, might also throw up fake news. What was the media's role in public policy? Public policy is essentially about government making any policy. For example, should we have farm laws, reform the farm laws? Should MSPs go up by 10% or 5%? Should public sector banks be privatized, or should they be nationalized? Should private banks be nationalized? Should public banks be privatized? Who should control inflation? Should RBI control inflation, or should the government of India control inflation? in the US, in the recent past, many of you might have heard about this whole debate about abortions. It's a huge issue in the US. So should there be a ban on abortions? Any of these things, I mean, there's no dearth of what all topics come under public policy. But now, if you go back to asking any of these questions, you'll have to go back to asking what are the facts of the case. It's almost like, if you've read Sherlock Holmes, the start of the story, Sherlock Holmes sits down and asks you to recount the facts of the case. What are the facts of the case? So the link between media and public policy is through facts. What are the facts of the case? And once the policy is made, then the media's job is again to report on whether this policy is being implemented correctly, whether it's having the intended impact, and report back to the public, and hopefully the government will take notice of it. So that's essentially the link. Now, even when, so I'm sort of cutting to the chase about what is the link. There are many different things that you can consider when you look at facts. So this is where media's role becomes very important. For example, this issue of, in India, bank privatization, nationalization or bank privatization, should public sector banks be privatized? A lot of people will have very dramatically different opinions. A lot of people will say all these public sector banks are lousy, they should be privatized, they are loss making. When they make losses, they force the government to raise taxes from common public to make up for those losses. So these banks, they're so lousy, we should just simply privatize them. Then the other side is, and those people who argue that public sector banks should be privatized, give all kinds of metrics of profitability, and they say that, look at the private sector banks, they have grown so much in market capitalization, their profits are so much higher, their NPAs, the bad loans, the loans which are not getting paid, that proportion is so much lower, they are so much more efficient, more technologically savvy and everything. That is one set of facts. Then there is another set of facts. Those who say that, no, we need public sector banks. And at the very least, the shift of taking public sector banks into the private sector, privatizing them, that should be a very gradual one. That should be a very slow one. And they throw up another set of facts. They say things like, who is giving the maximum number of Jan Dhan accounts? Who's creating maximum number of Jan Dhan accounts? So the government beats its chest by saying, and every government has done it in the past, so this is not specific to this government, every government does that. It says, we have created so many no-frills account or Jan Dhan accounts, zero balance accounts. But if you look at the data, you'll find that 99% of them are being made by the public sector banks, by the government banks, not by the private sector banks, right? Then if you look at another fact, which is who gives money for infrastructure building, you'll find that it's the public sector banks that are lending money for that. Who provides more bank branches, more ATMs, those facilities. These are all public sector banks. So now there are two competing sets of facts. Both are facts, but there are two competing sets of facts. And the public policy part, which is a trade-off which a finance minister or a prime minister or a cabinet has to decide which one is correct. Now, if the government is taking credit for, or if it wants to take credit for financial inclusion, then it cannot, ideally, also say in the same breath that we should take away all the public sector banks and sell them out and make them privatized. Why? Because all the government's own role of financial inclusion will get hurt, because private sector banks actually do not bring about financial inclusion. So it's a trade-off, and in any of these public policy matters, you'll have to go back to media to decide what are the facts of the case. Now, often I'm sure a lot of research happens, but where media might help is that they can give a picture much sooner to the date of the decision making. If suppose you're talking about farm distress, then the media can actually go ahead and travel to areas and rural areas and figure out what is happening and report from there. But all of this also brings into question the credibility of media, which over time has taken a massive hit because social media now presents a massive challenge to established mainstream media. And the next wave of challenges will come from artificial intelligence. That artificial intelligence now can sort of provide a lot of media engagement, a lot of services to readers. But we must also remember that again, there is a word called hallucination, that artificial intelligence, the chatbots and everything, they hallucinate, they imagine things and they throw that up. So there are issues with that also. So that's broadly the framework within which media interacts with on public policy. I would like to pause here, and it might be more helpful if the students, if they have any questions, they can ask that. I'm sorry, I'm a little short of time, so that's why I want to interact more than just give a lecture. If there are any questions, maybe I can answer them.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful and informative session. I request the chair, Professor Vibhuti ma'am, to share her remarks, and then we can proceed to the questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Uday Mishra, for your very erudite presentation. And first of all, you brought in the new issue, the current challenge of artificial intelligence and what implications it will have. I just want to comment on this, think about the investigative journalism that became most articulate and most pronounced in the post-emergency period. And what we saw the role of media in when the Nirbhaya tragedy took place, and the media played very important role, as a result of which Parliament had to make major amendments in the Indian Evidence Act. My question to you is that what is the connection between the electoral politics, public policy, and the media intervention, whatever contours of media intervention that takes because of the every 5 years politicians have to have a mandate from the mass system. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that must be said is that media should not charge itself with the job of changing governments. A lot of journalists have this notion that they can, that they are good journalists only if they bring about a change in government. Your hard-hitting story must lead to some kind of a government change. If it happens, that's a different matter. But I think journalists should again focus on reporting facts. I feel that there is a basic mantra that most journalists, I suppose, should have is that they should serve the public interest. Now, it is very unclear what public interest is. But more often than not, it's very difficult to define as such, but more often than not, most journalists know what is in the public interest, right? So we must, when reporting, when deciding on what issues to pick up, the idea must be to figure out what is the issue that will affect the largest people. It should not be based on whether it will serve the purposes of one small lobby. It might be popular lobby, but it might serve. But that is the problem where media has actually got stuck because of the profitability media losing out profitability because of the things that I mentioned. A lot. Just a second. Sorry. Yeah. So, I mean, because of media's profitability itself getting hit, there is a much greater desire to, write or raise issues which might get you profit, and we see that across the board, both in print and in online and in TV, that there is a natural tendency to do things which might get you profit, but they may not necessarily be in the larger interest, right? When you do things more often than not in the larger interest, it will require you to go and say things and report on things which may not be the most conducive things to hear. There'll be harsh truths, right? So when you're going about reporting, say, on farm distress in India, now, if you report it in an unbiased manner, the fact will come out that not only is there farm distress today, but that farm distress is an old problem. It's a decades old problem. And so there is no space for your personal biases or your choices. So every journalist does vote as a voter also, but their job is such that it requires them to be very unbiased about their reportage, and then they'll have to actually let the facts dictate their coverage. I think the AI part is a very is a thing that will be derived out of the hardcore reporting that will happen on the ground. The chatbot will not go out into the fields or to a manufacturing plant. Some reporter will have to go and report that. Now, it starts off by asking that question: are people going out to report? Are enough journalists going out to report? Are enough news publications going out to report? When I was in CNN IBN, when it started off as a news channel, and now it's called CNN News 18. The typical news bulletin had packages. The packages were, a certain Udit Mishra reporting from Bihar, or a certain Pallavi Gupta reporting from Madhya Pradesh, some part of Madhya Pradesh. It could be a city, could be a village, could be an urban story, rural story, but it was about 1.5 minutes of TV news reportage. But now that option has gone away. Now it's highly reactive. It's what the government said, what the opposition said. So what is happening is that, and this is what students have to understand, this is both a flaw in what is happening today, and it's also a business opportunity, that reporting of facts has gone out of the window. It's all reactive, it's all based on opinion, and you keep debating over a wrong opinion also, which may not be based on facts. Like yesterday on Twitter, I was seeing a top anchor tweeting a piece by a so-called top researcher in US, which was based on a Pew Center study. And it was all wrong. The researcher had got the Pew Center study wrong. The journalist did not confirm or check. They tweeted. When I went back to the Pew Center study, the facts were all wrong. The Pew Center study said something totally different. The researcher said something totally different. The media person just projected it to their own sort of what are the followers and stuff on Twitter. And all of a sudden, everything just, the facts just got out of the window, and it just gave another wave of opinions to be labeled all over it. So I feel that, it's not as if you mentioned about the rape case in 2012, which led to a lot of activity and a lot of action. But even at that time, I remember I was interviewing Professor Amartya Sen at that time, and he had mentioned a very salient point. He said that most of the focus has gone in that crisis also on the abuse of young women in India's cities, because that rape case made everybody realize that this can happen to our daughters, our sisters, right? When I say everybody, means people like us, people who have
opinion makers.
Yeah, people like us, not people like them. And who are these people like them? The people like them are the other India, right? Where women are traded, right? Where human trafficking happens. So if you look at the law also, at that time, the focus was more on punishing the guilty for such crimes and less about a structural change in how you look at human trafficking or treatment of women. So, I mean, again, what allowed that to happen? The media, while it was doing its good job in sort of highlighting a particular issue and saying that the government was not being sensitive enough or the law and order issues, it didn't go the whole hog. And this is where I'm saying the public interest. So at that time, the interest of the media was more on people like us, because that's who consume you as a consumer, the news that they can. But if you wanted public interest, then you would have asked bigger questions. You would have asked bigger questions like trafficking of women in India. You know, what happens to the poor women in India? You would have asked questions like, what is happening to women's participation in the society? The data shows in 2019, I did this story based on government data, that the number of women in the workforce in 2015-16, around that time, in 2017, were fewer than what were in 2004. So there were more women in absolute number working in India in 2004 than they were working in 2017. Now that tells you something, you know. People can say a lot of things that, you know, all women must be studying and whatever, and they must be having lovely families. But the fact is that women's participation in the formal workforce has come down. And if you ask yourself, again, this question of what is the central thing that would determine that women are not mistreated and that the public policy aspects are taken into account, it is women's role in the workforce. For example, why are street lights not proper? Right? Now, if half the consumers of the street light were women, why? Because they come from office at 10 o'clock in the night or go to office at 2 o'clock in the night, right? Then they would demand that. But if all the women are at home and never step out after 6 o'clock, then street lighting is not an issue. The same way public transport, you know. So if until unless half the women, you know, or half the population, that is women, are equal partners in public transport, consumers of public transport, public policy will not bend towards public transport. So we keep making more roads and we keep thinking that why, you know, we'll make more roads and the jams that we see, traffic jams we see, will reduce. But there's another approach, no? That if we were to make more public transport, more efficient public transport, then perhaps people will not buy as many cars. So in Delhi, which has more cars than Chennai, Mumbai, Kolkata, all put together, perhaps the situation cannot be remedied anymore. But what about Jaipur, Lucknow, Patna, right? So Jaipur, Lucknow, Patna, none of these cities still have the number of cars that they can possibly have if we continue to grow, and hopefully we'll continue to grow. So if public policy was really focused on public interest, right? And if journalists were playing that part, they'd be pointing out these things, right? They'll be reporting on the importance or the poor state of public transport, the importance of public transport, studies would be done. Public policy will then shift towards saying that, okay, instead of just making more roads, and in many cities in India, you'll see roads upon roads. Now there are 2 layers of roads because they're running out of space. Instead of just making more roads to get around the jam, improve public transport, you know, and that way disincentivize people buying cars. Why do we buy cars? Because we do not have reliable public transport. So things like that, you know. So yeah, the link between what the media does and how public policy is articulated is very intrinsic we don't always understand it. And we often look at the more the more sensationalizing bits of media, and we think that must be the all be all. But actually, in every situation, you'll have to pull back and ask if the media is actually even asking the larger public interest question. So media's role is to ask that question, report on those issues, and hopefully the government and the general population, when it reads this, sort of comes around, says, okay, maybe we need to reconfigure our minds, reconfigure our policy, and then approach the whole issue.
In the current debate on freebies versus subsidized transport or free transport in Karnataka, your today's article yesterday.
Exactly. So, I mean, I mostly find on this freebies, and so I'm an economics student, and there is no word like freebie in economic literature, right? There are subsidies, there are good subsidies, and there are bad subsidies. Now, what is a bad subsidy? If you say, Udit Mishra, I'm giving you 10,000 rupees to sit at your home, order from Swiggy, enjoy yourself, voting for me, that's a bad subsidy.
Yeah.
But if you say that I'm going to improve your school, improve public transport, right? If I'm going to improve health systems, right? Then that's a good subsidy. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
You know, for example, this again, in another economy, this is one of the central things, just like abortion is in US. You look at UK, United Kingdom. The biggest issue there is National Health Service that they have, right? Because they are, they care very deeply about publicly funded healthcare provisioning. Now, there's a big difference between publicly funded healthcare provisioning and an insurance-led model. So India has shifted from a publicly funded healthcare provisioning, where the government would provide through taxpayers' money and all the revenues, will provide healthcare to you, right? Which was the old model that India followed. Then we had RSBY, Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, and now we have the Ayushman Bharat, which is basically an extension of that, which is an American model, which is an insurance-led model. So instead of putting an MRI machine in the center of Bhopal, a government's MRI machine, right? The government saying, instead of this money being spent on one MRI machine, I can just break this to pay the premium for many people. But then, okay, you've got the premium, your premium is paid. But where do you get, when you're ill, you need healthcare provisioning. Who's going to provide the healthcare provisioning? So that now burden has been shifted to private sector. Now, private sector may or may not be there. As I said, public sector provided ATM branches, ATMs, and to the rural area, right? Private sector did not. It's the same on healthcare. Private sector will not go to the back of beyond in Madhya Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh to provide healthcare. So if a woman is pregnant, right, she'll still have to go all the way to Bhopal for a private this thing. Now that may or may not be possible, you know. So she has the money for say the delivery, that premium might be paid. But what about the money of this be in our country? What is a freebie?
Where was private sector before vaccinations came during the pandemic? They all
Where was the private sector, right? So I mean, this is again the if you look at across the board, you know, we had in 2019 we had a corporate tax cut. Now on paper, I would argue that your corporate tax cut helps matters because it incentivizes firms, businesses to increase their investments. But this happened in 2019 when, if you recall, if the students recall, if you guys recall, in 2019, we grew by less than 4%. And that year, news dominated. Maruti is not selling cars, nobody buying anything. There was all this thing. There were 3 years of economic deceleration. Why was that happening? Because people were not spending enough. So now there were two ways in which media could report this. One is media could report what is happening, what is the problem. The problem was consumption was coming down, right? The other thing was what the government did, which was it said that we need to boost investment, right? And it gave a corporate tax cut. So corporate tax cut is a good idea, but it was, I think, in my view, implemented at the wrong time. If that 1,50,000 crores, which were given as revenue foregone, right? If it was given and spent by the government on the public, either through direct spending or by giving a GST tax, GST cut, that we are reducing the taxes, the consumption levels would have gone up, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the latest GDP data, and I've done one piece on this, the main problem in India, despite all this, higher growth, and we are the fastest growing economy, is that our personal consumption levels are pretty low. That growth is very muted. Everybody's concerned about that. So this is a problem that has been going on. And last year we heard the finance minister really exasperated, saying that, why after the corporate tax cut also, we don't have the private sector investing more. She said that, why isn't Hanuman flying and all that? So, we have to look at facts, and that is what will inform public policy. If the journalists fail in pointing out the facts, public policy will be misinformed, or if it's poor, it will never get tweaked.
No, and whole thing, the obsession about freebie, the way mainstream economics valorize the concept of freebie instead of income support, which was needed at the time of this emergency. They were only talking about the freebies and people acting as a sponge on the economy. So they also diverted the attention. No?
Ma'am, I also have a question, Udit sir, if you allow. Yes, sir, we often discuss about a lot of schemes which our central government or even state government has. For example, we have Mudra loan, or for example, we have various pension schemes, but the rates are so low, 200 rupees per month, 400, there is no revision as such. Even in case of PM Kisan, we are given 500 rupees of support per month. So not even half a liter of milk for a month will come with that support. How do you see that in terms of outreach, and in terms of the quality of support we are giving? How do you see in terms of India? Because there is no bottom. In NHS or even in US, we see there is some decent amount which the government is giving, but how do you see in terms of India, focusing most of the schemes are for poor?
Okay, is this question for me?
Yes, sir.
So yeah, if because I missed in between, so the connection went away. You're asking about MSPs not being high enough for India.
Sir, MSP, also other schemes. For example, we have pension schemes. So 200, 400, some state government gives 1,000. These amounts are very low. Even for PM Kisan, we are giving 500 rupees, not even half a liter milk for, a month. So how do you see the effectiveness of them in terms of beneficiary and kind of support we give?
Yeah, I see. I feel that, so first of all, MSPs, India has a very fundamental problem with agriculture, because there is too many people dependent on agriculture. Agriculture does not provide as much value, unlike, say, manufacturing or services. There's too many people dependent on agriculture. With every generation, the plots become smaller, economies doesn't support it. So at some point, India has to pull a lot of people out of agriculture. But even in the West, you see the farmers get a lot of subsidies from farmers. So farming is not necessarily the most lucrative or remunerative profession. Even when it's done in large scale, then it is perhaps, but even there, farmers in the US and Europe get a lot of subsidies. We do not get as many subsidies. Indian farmers do not get. I did one piece on that, the height of that discussion, whether Indian farmers get any subsidies or not. We get precious little. The West gives far more subsidies to its farmers. Now, but there is no. But the problem is that Indian government is not so rich. We as an economy, we do not earn as much. We do not raise as much revenues. So I think it'll take some time before India has enough revenues to actually pay its farmers enough And to do that also, the other solution is to pull a lot of farmers out from agriculture and have them in manufacturing and services jobs. But sadly, manufacturing is the sector which actually soaks up the excess labor. It is capable of actually soaking up a lot of excess labor from the farming sector, but our manufacturing has not gone anywhere. Again, this is not a story of the last 6 or 7 years. It's a broader story. India's manufacturing hasn't really kicked on. And that is one big problem. As far as the PM Kisan or any of these things these are actually band-aids, This is actually the remedy. The odd thing is that this is actually the remedy. Giving 500 rupees per month or tranches of 2,000 rupees, or perhaps by next election will be 9,000 rupees. That is the remedy, because that is just basically saying that I have no other solution but to give you money to get by another month. Even though it's not much, well, this is all I can give you. Who else is giving you any more, or where are you? What are your other options? So it's an acceptance of saying that, I would not count, say, Narega, or the good old notion of food security. The original notion of public sector of food security was that if you are poor, it was a self-selection program, right? There was no targeted PDS. There was PDS. There's public distribution system. So I can go and get grains from PDS if I feel that I'm poor enough and I'm willing to stand for 8 hours in the sun to get the grain, right? So it was a self-selection method. You didn't have any notion that somebody will siphon off anything. The idea was that if you're poor, you will go stand up in the line, either apply for a job or for a food for work kind of a thing, or apply for cheap grains. But any of these things where you sort of say that I can just give you money for nothing, just that is essentially a rebel. I don't think it's enough, but I don't think there are easy solutions for the distress that is there in India. It'll take years and years of very fast growth for us to sort of overcome this. Yeah.
So I have a twofold question. One is, how do media engage, review, and make significant contributions to the development of public policy and laws? And the second one is, what strategies can young people employ to actively participate in this field and also make meaningful contributions to shaping policies and pursue a career in the future?
See, at one level, the job in media is fairly straightforward. You go report, and then you go and ask questions to whoever is responsible. It's no rocket science. It's one of the simplest things one can do. And I think the failings of media are largely twofold. One is intent, whether the media is biased and complicit in not wanting to ask those questions or not wanting to even report on those issues. Or it could be simply a matter of economics that, well, going out reporting is much costlier. Let's just sit at home and not do anything. Do something which is easier to deal with and will not attract any problems. So, so that is the way the media reports is that, suppose drought, for example, every year, many of you, just pay attention to this next time when that happens. I think there might be some episodes this year. The announcement of a drought is a deeply political issue, right? So, because the moment the government accepts that there is a drought, state government or a national government accepts that there is a drought, then there are a lot of other things that kick in. A lot of things that the government then has to do. So the governments typically delay announcing that there is a drought. Right? Now, this is a public policy issue, and it cannot be remedied by just a farmer, because a farmer or a group of farmers might just continue to suffer. It's a media's job to go and report and say that there is a very valid case why the government must look into it and raise public awareness, and through that public pressure before the government, ask questions of the government, the agriculture minister or whoever. What is the state? Why has, say, a drought not been announced if most of the media reports are showing that farmers are in deep distress? Now, this is exactly how a public policy can be shaped if media was to go ahead and report. So if every day you go and report on those matters and ask the minister, ask the government, you will both raise the heat on them, you would also raise public awareness, and through that further heat on them to perhaps respond to a situation. So that is part of the first answer to the first question on what media can do. As far as what you guys can do or what students can do, well, I think media, journalism is struggling for good minds, for dedicated professionals. I suppose, it's, frankly, I think it's tougher today because there are, by not doing what you're supposed to do in media, you often get paid more. So it's quite remarkably perverse the way incentives are. But if you're dedicated, then there's lots of opportunity. As I said in the beginning, there's a huge opportunity because there are two things that are missing. One is in the general discourse, in the general public discourse, you'll find two things missing. One is credibility, the other is facts, and both are related. So if you can bring, if you can shine light on facts, build credibility, show yourself to be an unbiased reporter on things, then perhaps it can help matters. It can help readers understand, make sense of the world around them.
Can I just ask one question?
Sure.
Yeah, you rightly said that the media should report the fact, but they are not doing it. But my question is that how to build the accountability of media? Is there any law, any public policy which is there, or should we made it, or what should we do to really make media accountable? Because a lot of things are happening because of media, and then media is not held accountable anywhere. And that is the problem I think we have today.
So, I mean, media has been going through, if you look around the world, it's been a tough question to answer. A huge part of what media does has to be seen in the context of its ownership. So I was, in all of my experience, I think BBC is the only model, or say BBC, or say the trust model that Guardian has, right? These are the kind of models which can survive the pulls and pressures of everyday life. BBC is funded by the public. Guardian has a trust of its own. Guardian suffers economically as against, say, other papers which are which are of poorer quality but make more money. But Guardian has been able to withstand that because it has a trust money dedicated for this, and so it can sort of defend its freedom. I feel that ownership matters, because if media ownership is in the hands of few people, first of all, Rupert Murdoch is one good example in the West. And in India also, we are increasingly seeing that just a few people are increasingly cornering media ownership. It will be very natural to imagine in such a scenario that media will not be able to ask questions of public interest, because often enough those questions of public interest will run against the owner's interest. And this is central to, and this is something that sooner or later Indian public will have to decide. I think it will be later, because I think Indian public is just right now too busy with other issues. I don't think anybody cares too much about in media being unbiased. I think right now the country is in the throes of a phase where we want to only hear what is agreeable. If it's not agreeable, then we don't want to interact. And that is not the right approach for a solution. So I suspect that we'll see at least a decade or two more of this before, there comes a turning point where people say, okay, we need an unbiased setup, whether it comes through our pockets, the taxpayers pay for it, like a BBC model, or we create, or some of the richer people in the country create these trusts, so a rich guy who's a multimillionaire or billionaire says, okay, I'm putting this amount of money in a trust and that will run it. I think Tribune, in Punjab, Tribune has that trust model. And then that trust has to be big enough to support capable journalists, because again, nothing comes out of free. And if you do not pay journalists enough, you will not attract best talent. They will go away and do something else. So, places like UK, I found that some of the best minds came into journalism. In India, that may not necessarily be the case, because I think the earning potential of other professions is far more. And so it does not attract the best minds necessarily. And that also has an implication on what media does eventually. To come back to your question, it's a tough one. I think ownership, just like, we have laws against monopoly, that one person will not hold all the airlines, one person will not have all the telecom companies. I think there must be laws at some point to safeguard media also somewhere, but otherwise, media will follow. If it's a business, it will follow its own logic. There won't be any, that's not a surprise. Muhammad has a question.
Sir. Sir, so you mentioned like BBC. So I just want to ask if that if the state owns media, then is it a good thing or a bad thing? Like the state owning a.
No, so you're getting me wrong. State-owned media is Doordarshan. BBC is not state-owned media. Yeah. State publicly owned means it has to be paid by the public, and that is its freedom is secure. So the bureaucrat cannot sit on it, the minister cannot sit on it and say what will happen. With Doordarshan, that is not Doordarshan. Doordarshan is run by the government and largely follows a lot of the government diktats. It's not free in the way BBC is free. I'm not saying that BBC is has no blemishes. BBC has a long history of all kinds of compromises. But even so, within the framework, BBC is the most credible media organization in the world. Even within UK, when surveys were done repeatedly, BBC was far more credible than every other public or private institution, from politicians to actors to everybody. It beat everybody. So, the reason for that is that relative freedom within BBC is far more, because it is paid for through a sort of a charge by the public, and nobody can touch that, and that is secure. Now, in fact, in UK, they're trying to break that system, and there's a lot of opposition against that should not happen. So what I mean is not state-owned media. I'm not saying the government should own it. I'm saying the public should own it. How do you own it? You pay for it and you safeguard its freedom. You say you will not listen to the minister, you will not listen to the bureaucrat, and you will not listen to anybody. You will just go about doing your work. Now, there's always this question mark. No matter how much freedom you give to that media, you can always say that we made Udit Mishra thinking that Udit Mishra is such a dedicated journalist, but he became corrupt when he became the head of this organization, and he directed everybody in a wrong direction. But this is the point, that if the incentives in the media in that particular body, BBC or whatever, are such that are correctly framed, then you will not allow one person to go haywire or violate everything, right? So it's a difficult question. It's a way institutions are formed, but you will have to, media because its job is almost like an island. We have to stand away from both the society and the government and the industry, and then report. I cannot look at a farmer. So this is very important. A lot of people think that anybody who's saying there is this pro-farmer, anti-farmer kind of a thing. And this is like goes back to the first two words that I used for reporting facts. There's no pro-farmer, anti-farmer, nothing. I'm supposed to report facts. Pani aaya ki nahi aaya, kamai hui ki nahi hui, how much money was earned, how much was not. Just report the facts. Let people decide. So it's not about pro-farmer, anti-farmer. Just state the facts. And I think that kind of freedom has to be given, and that has to be shielded. Otherwise, no journalist would ever do that for you. I mean, why would they do it? They'll simply take another job or become quote unquote corrupt and just take more money and rise up in the profession. I think I see a question from Mohammed, I think somewhere.
Yes, Mohammed Abdullah Hamid, you have raised your hand, you can unmute yourself. And
There are
speak.
two questions. Yeah. By Mr. Mohammed.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my second question. My second question is that, do you believe that media bias exists? And if so, how should it be addressed through laws and public policies without compromising journalistic integrity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that media bias exists is like not even a doubt. Obviously, media bias exists, and this notion that all journalists, just because they joined journalism, would not have their opinions is not fair. No human being will not have any opinion. They'll have opinions. Whether that leads to bias or not, so I want to distinguish one thing between opinion and bias. I can have an opinion. Should women have the right to have abortion? Now, I might have a personal opinion, but when I'm reporting on issues, say on abortion, and if the data shows that most of the women want to have the freedom to have abortion, and suppose I believe that abortion is a sin against God, I cannot kill that story. I cannot tweak that story. If I do that, that is bias. Having an opinion that abortion is a sin against God is an opinion, and that I should be allowed. I'm a human being, I should be allowed. Now, is media biased? I would say yes. A lot of media is biased. If we had unbiased media, the discourse would be very different, as I said, and it's biased not just because it has, often media is biased not even because it has opinions. It's biased because it's craven. It's lazy or coward, so that bias doesn't necessarily come from opinion. Also, a bias could be just out of laziness. I don't care about the reader. Now, how can it be solved? I'm sure that there is, I mean, if you give the politicians when you said laws, as a journalist, I would say that, if you give politicians a right to make a law over journalists, you will never get unbiased media. So please keep the notion of laws out of journalism, that, it has to be then, it seems like a very odd thing, but media is supposed to be responsible eventually to the reader, right? So on paper, or at least in theory, it should work like this. If I am giving you false information, biased information to all of you, suppose all of you are my readers, then at long last, you will decide that Udit Mishra is not giving you fair information, he's biased. You will stop reading me or listening to me, and you will go to another person. That is how media should ideally work. It doesn't require just normal mechanics of what is credible, what is fair will work. Where it trips is when you don't want to hear what is disagreeable. Where you say, I will not listen to Udit Mishra because he's saying something that is not acceptable to me or doesn't fit into my ideology. Now, today we are going through a phase, and this is not just India, the world over, it's a fairly polarized world. We're going through a phase, and perhaps historians will write more about this, that where opinions are very sharply polarized. And this has happened in the wake of, say, the global financial crisis, a lot of inequalities, and there's a lot of lack of, the trust in institutions has fallen. Media has been part of that. And every country has had their own pivotal moments. In UK, in 2012, when I was there was this whole Levison inquiry going on because phone hacking scandals had happened in UK. Media had overreached, so they had their moment. US has had its moments. India has had its own moments on different topics. I don't think that laws are the way. No prime minister or cabinet will ever allow media to speak against it. So a law will not work because the laws will be favored in the direction of the ruling class or the rulers, as it were. And media is supposed to report on the governed, as it were. Yeah, I think more openness. I would trust that if you allowed media of all kinds to prosper openly, then over time you will know which one is biased and which one is not, and you will go for them. You will go for the unbiased one, the credible one. Credibility has to be earned. All journalists have to earn their credibility by working day in and day out. And over time, readers will realize which reporter or which publication has earned their trust. That is the only way I imagine. Yes, you should safeguard those things. For example, in US, there is a constitutional safeguard to freedom of speech. In UK, there is none, right? In UK, there is no constitutional safeguard to freedom of speech, right? In India, we derive freedom of press from Article 19. It's a derived right, right? There's no fundamental right to freedom of speech or press. So I think we need to have safeguards to allow free speech, but I don't think laws per se is the way forward.
Right. Sir, we take this last question. Mohammad Abdullah ji, you have two questions. You can briefly ask. And Mohammad ji is also joining us from Pakistan. So if you like to share anything relevant from your country, if you ask the panelist.
All right, sure. So my question is that some argue that defamation laws can be used to suppress legitimate criticism and investigative journalism. And we see this a lot happening here back in Pakistan, whether it's the Capital Territory or whether there are cities in Lahore or Karachi. We see this happening all the time. Now, my question is, how do you strike a balance between protecting individuals' reputations, but also simultaneously safeguarding free speech rights? We see this as an issue. We see this as a national issue here in Pakistan. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, I think it's an issue in India also. I think my view on this is fairly straightforward. There should not be any criminal defamation. You cannot put me behind bars for trying to speak the truth to bar. You can say that there has been a defamation if I have said something untrue. But more often than not, that is not the case. More often than not, you use these laws and this provisioning to hold back from the truth coming out. I think, as it's also said, truth is the exact defense against any such defamation or any such contention. As long as I'm reporting the truth, I should not at least be facing criminal defamation. This is a very colonial, and in that sense, India and Pakistan have a lot of laws which go back to the colonial times. this is a very this is a very arbitrary way to go about it, and especially in a free country. If we aspire to be a free country, we must have that freedom to speak freely. Yes, there'll be excesses when there is free speech. Nobody can deny that. It's not too hard to see, but not a criminal defamation. Not a criminal defamation law. Limited to civil cases at least. Is that it?
Yes, I think that's it. Those are the questions. So I would like to thank you for the session and taking time out from your busy schedule and is this event. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Now I request the chair, Professor Vibhuti ma'am, to give her closing remarks.
Yeah, I think today we had a very rich discussion, very grounded in the our reality, and the question and answer session also, and read the discourse. Professor Uday Shankar, he talked about the relationship of executive and judiciary. Where are the lines drawn? What are the constitutional guarantees? And where the judicial activism starts and where should it end? No, so the boundaries, and we had a very interesting discussion. The second discussion on law, public policy, and media was even more invigorating with the erudite presentation of Shalu Udit Mishra, who has himself done extensive field-based reporting. And so many questions of media ethics, media accountability, the human rights of the journalist, and also those who are and the importance of certain public discourses which are uncomfortable, whether it is a farm laws or say the labor codes, which he did not mention, but I think it is also equally responsible. The 4 new labor codes which are replacing the 200 state-specific legislations and 48 central legislations. About that also, the media has played a pivotal role in keeping issues center stage. Challenges that the media is facing from the social media, fake news, and in today's geopolitical context of polarized public opinion and the democratic majoritarianism. I think these are very mind-boggling issues that we had in today's discussion. I'm sure it will expand the horizons of our understanding of these complex issues of governance, judiciary, law, and the role of the media and public institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, ma'am. With the chair's permission, we can go for a vote of thanks.
please go ahead, Smita. Yeah.
As we come to the end of day 4, Law and Public Policy Youth Fellowship, an online national summer school program, a 2-month online immersive legal awareness and action research certificate training course and internship program, I, Uday Shankar, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI, New Delhi. We are grateful to our expert for the day 4 session, Professor Uday Shankar and Shalu Udit Mishra, for taking out their valuable time and giving us an opportunity to learn from this online certificate program. We thank our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, and lead advisor, Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam, for convening the session. We thank all of our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We look forward to welcoming you this Wednesday, that is 21st June at 11:30 a.m. for our 5th day of the certification course by distinguished experts, Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam and Dr. Nivedita P. Haran. We are grateful if you're watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in future to our IMPRI, #WebPolicyTalk and #WebPolicyLearning. Wishing you a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.